Silent Hill is a small New England resort town with a mysterious power. The exact nature of the town and the origin of its power remain a mystery, though one thing is certain. Silent Hill can tap into a person's innermost psyche and torture them with manifestations of their deepest anxieties and dark pasts. Nowhere is this power used more effectively than in Silent Hill 2. The monsters in the town are mostly based on the mind of protagonist James Sunderland, who travels to Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his wife Mary, who had died from an illness 3 years prior. Throughout the game, we begin to learn that James has a dark secret buried deep within his mind, the monster designs hinting at the secret before the secret is finally revealed towards the end. The game's story is wonderfully told, and I highly recommend playing the game before watching any further, as this video will delve into the ending of the game in order to discuss my own alternate interpretation of the game's disturbing symbolism. You have been warned. As James travels through the town, he meets a number of strange and troubled individuals. First is Maria, a mysterious, flirtatious woman who looks almost identical to Mary. She's seemingly killed a number of times throughout the game before showing up again perfectly fine with no memory of their previous deaths. The other two, Eddie and Angela, both have secrets of their own. Eddie was bullied his whole life, finally snapping and shooting a man in the leg and killing his dog. Angela was abused both physically and sexually by her father, before eventually taking a knife and stabbing him to death. There is also a young girl named Laura who hates James and claims to have known Mary, despite clearly being too young to have known a woman who died 3 years prior. It soon becomes clear that Maria is a manifestation of the town, intended to represent Mary, and that Eddie, Angela and James are not in the town by coincidence. At the end of the game, James finds a videotape showing James himself smothering Mary with a pillow, both to end her suffering and also so he could finally move on with his life. After facing his demons and accepting what he has done, James is finally able to leave the town, though whether or not he does depends on the ending, and James's canonical fate remains unknown. The beautifully crafted story and symbolism across the entire game has led to Silent Hill 2 being considered one of the greatest video games of all time, and one of the finest examples of storytelling in the medium. There are two particular monsters in this game that proved very popular among the fans and have since become series staples. The first is the bobblehead nurses, who naturally resemble nurses, albeit with their heads facing backwards and showing off a lot of cleavage. These are generally accepted to represent the lustful way James viewed the nurses when visiting the bedridden Mary due to being sexually repressed. The second monster is by far the more infamous of the two. Pyramid Head is a monster that stalks James throughout his entire journey. Pyramid Head serves a number of purposes throughout the game. First is attempting to kill both James and Maria, even having Maria killed in a similar bed to Mary's hospital bed. Second is to actually help James by allowing him access to areas he could not otherwise reach. Both of these acts are intended to push James closer to the truth surrounding his wife's death. The final role of the monster is to represent James's sexual frustration by raping other monsters at various times in the story. Pyramid Head's form comes from a painting at the Silent Hill Historical Society depicting an executioner of the town's dark past. The generally accepted theory is that James saw this painting when he visited the town with his wife, and the image was so striking to James that his subconscious mind adopted the painting as the image of capital punishment. In 2013, 12 years after the game's initial release, I finally had the opportunity to play the game as part of the Silent Hill HD collection. As I played, I developed another interpretation of Pyramid Head and the nurses by extension. Having first experienced the series through Silent Hill Homecoming, in my mind Pyramid Head had always been a huge, imposing figure. Upon reaching the first combat encounter with Pyramid Head, however, I realised that that was only the movie version and those based on it. The original Silent Hill 2 version of Pyramid Head is actually about the same size as James, helmet notwithstanding. This led me to the idea that Pyramid Head does not just represent a punisher to James, but James himself. My theory goes that in much the same way Maria represents Mary, Pyramid Head represents James, hence the creature's repeated murder of Maria representing James killing Mary. Despite not consciously remembering the deed, James subconsciously sees himself as a butcher of sorts, murdering his wife and potentially others, and donning the terrifying attire of the town's great executioner to do so. Not only that, but Pyramid Head also represents James's subconscious self-loathing, and also his desire to rediscover the truth, explaining the creature's attitude towards James himself. This theory explains the murderous aspects of Pyramid Head, but what about the sexual aspects, and the nurses as well? As stated before, the nurses are believed to represent James's sexual frustration, that he wanted sex during those 3 years but never had any due to Mary's illness.
But who's to say he didn't? What if
James gave in to his lust during one visit and had sex with one of the nurses? Possibly had her face away so he could pretend it was Mary, or to alleviate the guilt of the deed. Perhaps, despite his best efforts, the guilt became too much, and he began to view himself as a sexual deviant, possibly even seeing his betrayal of Mary as being just as bad as rape. Of course, the sexual portion of this theory is not rock solid. If James did do this, why then would he not confess this to Mary, either before her death or during his final meeting with her in some of the game's endings? Why, if the murder aspects are so prevalent in the environment and monster designs, would the sexual aspects of his guilt not also be represented to a much greater degree? Why would there not be a videotape or recording of his infidelity? Perhaps the raping simply represents a more violent outlet for James's sexual frustration, rather than anything as deep and complex as sexual guilt. While the theory may not be as sound as the usually accepted meanings behind the symbolism, I still believe it to be an interesting interpretation of what the game presents, and I think it speaks to the strength of the writing and the planning of this game, that new and interesting interpretations of the enemies and backstory can be thought up even over a decade after its initial release.